Seen nothing yet. Don't be fooled into thinking this disaster movie is coming to an end. Rishi Sunak was quick off the mark last week with his pitiful, self-serving claims about having known the lockdowns were a bad thing, but that despite him drumming his tiny fists on the table until they were a little bit sore, no one would listen to him. He said his heroic efforts to avert disaster were deleted from the official records of meetings he attended. If that's true, if minutes of meetings affecting government policy were doctored, then Sunak's claims demand criminal investigation and jail time for those responsible, including bigwigs with letters after their names, who presumably knew the truth of it as well and kept their mouths shut, while people needlessly died miserable deaths, endured miserable lives, and the country was driven off a cliff. Sunak squeaks that he was on the right side of history, but powerless. What absolute twaddle. He was arguably the second most powerful figure in government. By his own admission, he went along with all that was done to us. If it had ever been about principles, he would have resigned the first time his dissent was ignored and erased. He would have made his way hot foot to a television studio and there delivered an honest statement about how doing the right thing was more important than keeping his job. He did none of those things. For all that, there's excitement in the air. The mere fact the former Chancellor and would-be Prime Minister has broken ranks, basically opting for the tried and trusted playground tactic of claiming a big boy did it and ran away, means many are scenting blood in the water. I'm hearing a lot of people, desperate and hopeful that the whole truth will finally come out, saying things like, the narrative is finally falling apart. It might be and it might not, but the COVID and lockdown double act is expendable. They've wrung all the juice they're ever going to get out of that rotten fruit, and now it's ready to be cast aside. Or maybe it'll just go on the back burner while other, fresher concoctions are brought forward. Either way, someone somewhere seems to have decided it's time to move on. Just don't be fooled into thinking that stuff about saving Granny and the NHS was ever the point, far less the main event. I've said before, and I'll say it again, it's never about what they say it's about. Thousands of grannies and grandpas died anyway, and the NHS is a vast money pit that sucks in billions and now shuts its doors against people dying of cancer. I don't believe the last 2 years was ever about public health. The people who said lockdowns would kill many more than COVID have been proved right. I've listened ad nauseum to all that stuff about it was so scary in the beginning, those images from China, our leaders were just doing what they thought was right. Yada, yada, yada. I barely bought it then, and now it seems obvious that from the beginning, whatever COVID was or wasn't, wherever it came from, it was blatantly exploited in pursuit of long-planned goals. From the beginning, I say it was about fear and control. The good ship pandemic is holed below the waterline, and all the rats are scuttling towards the life rafts. All the lies about COVID, all the lies about vaccines, more and more exposed every day. On the other side of the Atlantic, micro-megalomaniac Anthony Fauci is making for dry land as fast as his little paws will propel him. There are so many rats on that sinking ship, however, that they know there won't be enough rafts. They're aboard the Titanic, and many won't make it. Here's hoping. Now that some of the great and the good are changing their tune, now that more and more of the mainstream media are pirouetting like ballerinas, and finally contemplating questions some of us have been asking, shouting indeed, on a desperate loop for months and years, there's a narrow window of opportunity for getting some other stuff out into the open. And so now seems like the right time to think more of the unthinkable and say more of the unsayable. Things are unfolding now exactly as the so-called conspiracy theorists, us with the tin hats on, said they would. And while everyone else, those who poured scorn and ridiculed and hated, surely have to face the fact that we, the outcasts who lost work and reputations and much else besides, were right all along about the unforgivable damage of locking down, about harms to children, about being determined to refuse the COVID injections. In this brief moment, while those who had nothing to offer but spite and vitriol and undisguised loathing for those of us who first suspected we were being sold a pup, and who felt something wrong in our guts, and so bothered to do our own reading, and learned we were absolutely right, and so spoke out and kept speaking out. Right now, before those smug smarty pants regroup behind the next line trotted out by the establishment, we can state some more of the blindingly obvious. Let me, on behalf of my fellow conspiracy theorists, put more of the truth out there. After all, in a few months' time, it's what those same smarty pants will be saying they knew all along as well. Here's what I make of the bigger picture and what some of us so-called COVIDiots, anti-vaxxers, Putin apologists, fascist, far-right extremist, swivel-eyed loons want to talk about next. Whatever is happening in Ukraine to that country and to its people, both are undoubtedly being used by those who also need something and someone to make their own populations look the other way. The horror show in the Ukraine is being exploited. Here at home last week, Boris implied that while only lesser mortals are fretting selfishly about heat and food, his attentions are focused on the lofty heights of saving the world. The little people of Britain must endure cold and hunger for, guess what, the greater good. Anyone with even the faintest grasp on, at least an interest in geopolitics, knows it's utterly bogus and he is a fraud, along with Biden, Trudeau, Macron, von der Leyen and the rest of a list so long I don't have time to read it out. The imminent cold and hunger were made inevitable not by Putin in 2022, but years ago by the adoption of ruinous, ideologically driven nonsense presented as world-saving environmental policies that only denied us any hope of energy independence, the profitable exploitation of all the resources beneath our feet and seas, and condemned much of Europe to dependence on Russia. What we are paying is the cost of going green when those policies are not green at all, but predicated upon some of the most destructive and toxic practices and technologies ever conceived. Wind and solar will never provide the energy we need to keep thriving as societies, to grow and flourish. The situation is so insane, I find it easiest to conclude we are simply meant to do without. Stop thinking we're all going to have cars and international travel and warm homes, just different than before. What seems obvious is that we're being groomed to live small lives, to make way for the grandiose expectations and entitlements of the elites that are working so effectively to hoover up the last of the wealth. Smaller lives, colder lives, may actually be the best we can hope for, given the plans evidently laid out for us by those with their hands on the levers of power. Our leaders used to tell us we needed them in order to be free. In future, they will have us believe we need them to be safe. Caged animals are safe, but it's not much of a life. Energy prices will keep going up. This will obviously hurt the poorest countries and poorest people first and worst. What is obvious about the green warriors making war on affordable, reliable energy is that they care not a jot about the poor, at least not the actual poor, alive in the world today. Those real flesh and blood people are to be sacrificed by the millions, utterly denied the energy that might have lifted them out of poverty, so that imaginary people, as yet unborn, might thrive in a utopia that exists only in the imaginations of pampered protesters. China will just burn more coal to compensate and seize more control, but shh, best not mention it. That corrupted thinking comes from communism, or perhaps communism's idiot cousin, socialism. Green warriors don't care about the poor, in the same way socialists don't care about the poor. They just hate the rich, which is ironic, given that with their infantile protests they're doing the work of the very richest for them. Ukraine produces a fifth of the wheat crop required by the poorest. Not this year, though. Whatever has been grown will be hard to store and harder to export, so that hunger and full-blown famine becomes a looming threat for hundreds of millions of the world's hungriest people. In richer countries, life is being made deliberately impossible for farmers. Spiking costs of fertilisers and fuel are one thing, but governments in the Netherlands, across Europe, in Canada and elsewhere around the world are persecuting those who grow our food. Farmers are being made to endure restrictions that destroy their businesses, being driven off their land altogether. They'll have to watch as fields they have known and cared for over generations are hoovered up by transnational organisations with other ideas about what that land might be used for. If you think mass migration and immigration are difficult problems now, wait until the unavoidable famines cause a hemorrhage of humanity out of the poorest countries of Africa and the Middle East. Perhaps hundreds of millions of people with nothing more to lose. Where do you think they'll go? And here's another inconvenient truth. Money and weapons keep flowing into Ukraine, but despite months of war and sanctions, the Russian ruble remains strong and an end to hostilities seems as far away as ever. Maybe no one wants that war to end. Wars don't determine who's right anyway. Wars determine who's left. Ultimately, this is all about wealth and power. Not money, remember. Money is to wealth as a menu is to a steak. One's a worthless bit of paper, the other something that will keep you alive. This is about actual wealth and its acquisition. It's about the already super rich getting hold of even more of the real things: land, buildings, natural resources, gold. While we are supposed to be frightened out of our wits, squabbling among ourselves and just hoping that one day it will all be over, a relative handful of others are hoovering up all the wealth as planned. Whichever way you slice it, an economic and societal shock on a scale that has not happened in lifetimes, if ever, is on its way. The world we live in is built in its entirety upon unimaginable and now unsustainable levels of debt. Trillions, quadrillions of dollars worth. There's always much more debt in the world than money, so that it's never possible to settle the debt. Now that debt, all that created money, is about to come crashing down. Don't be fooled by Sunak and the rest and their about-face, their pretence that they were with us all along. COVID and lockdown carried them only so far, but they plan to go much further. Disease, war, famine, death. The same people always ride on the same 4 horses. Now is not the time to take our eyes off the ball, not by a long chalk. Keep watching The Usual Suspects. As I say, you ain't seen nothing yet.